Tonight, you just have my introduction, and that is that we post the biographies and CVs online of everybody. So you probably know who you're here to talk about. I first learned about Dr. Quigley really through my wife, which is kind of a private matter. But since then, I have had to sit next to him singing for his supper, I think I said to him earlier, at many fundraising events and so on. He's the kindest man, and does a great job with the Underwood Center, where he is primarily where we know him from. So that'll be my total introduction, because he is going to introduce himself, I think, more personally than I've ever even got to hear him talk about. So I'm going to call it at that point terse and done, and give you Dr. Eamonn Quigley.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I was going to thank you. Thank you very much. That's very good. Okay. Okay. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. So first of all, thank you, Jeffrey and Heather. Thank you for inviting me. I'm not used to speaking to mostly non-medical audiences, so it's with great trepidation that I stand before you this evening, and I want to thank you for coming out, and hopefully you'll bear with me, and you might even learn something as we go along. So what I'm going to do is a kind of a concoction. I've put together a little bit of my personal history, because I've done it in a way that interweaves with my work in this area and how this area has evolved over the years, and also some of the particular areas that I've been involved in. And then at the end, I'll give some overview of the area as well. So what I do for most of my life is see patients. And for reasons that are best known to nobody, I have been particularly interested in people who have what we now refer to as disorders of gut-brain interaction. It's a very grandiose term for some very common disorders, but I like the term a lot. These disorders, as you will see, are very common. They cause a lot of symptoms, which are very impactful for the individual, but we don't know a lot about them, because when we examine them, we don't find very much. When we do biopsies, we don't find anything. When we do imaging, we don't find anything in particular, and treatment in general is unsatisfactory. And just to show you how common these disorders are, this is the first global survey of these conditions, which I actually was involved in. As you can see, it wasn't a complete coverage of the entire world, but it's the best we've got. And as you can see on the table over here, that these disorders, no matter where you look in the world, they're extremely common, with between 30 and 40% of the population having one of these complaints at any given time. They're more common in females, they're more common in younger individuals, and they are particularly common, and maybe slightly more common in some countries than in others. For example, irritable bowel syndrome, which is the disorder that I spend most time worrying about, is, as you can see here, much more common in Egypt than it is in Japan. Why this is, we don't quite know, but there are some variations. So these disorders are very common. And what are these disorders? Unfortunately, up until recently, we used the term functional to describe a lot of them. And the functional was really our clever way of saying, we don't understand it, we don't know what's going on. So there was functional heartburn. You all know about gastroesophageal reflux disease. There are some people who've got classical reflux symptoms, but we don't find any acid involvement or any evidence that acid involved. There are other people who've got dyspepsia that we can't explain, irritable bowel syndrome, constipation, bloating, abdominal pain of central origin. So these are very common conditions. And as my late mother-in-law once said to me, why devote a career to this? In fact, she went further and said to my wife, I think shortly after we were married, she said, why didn't Eamonn become a cardiologist or a neurologist? Gastroenterology, what does he want to do that for? So anyway, that's how I started off. So what I'm talking about, you could in lay terms refer to as the angry gut. That's the people who get a lot of symptoms after they eat with dyspepsia, or who get a lot of lower GI symptoms associated with bowel discomfort, which of course is the irritable bowel syndrome. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own background. as maybe one or two of you have guessed, I'm actually not from Texas originally. I'm actually from Cork in Ireland, where I went to medical school. And then later on, after I finished medical school, for really obscure reasons, I decided to do my medicine residency in Glasgow in Scotland. This is about the only picture I could find of Glasgow in the 1970s. And this was the Western Infirmary, which I worked in for 4 years. But the real reason I'm showing you this is this gentleman, who's Geoffrey Watkinson. Geoffrey Watkinson was an extremely modest and incredibly accomplished individual who did a lot of great things in his life. And he was particularly interested in actually both liver disease and inflammatory bowel disease. But he was an incredibly inspiring character to me, and he's the person who made me go into gastroenterology. And one of the things he did was that, no, I never studied in Oxford, I can't claim this, but one of the things he did do, and of course I had to mention Matthew Arnold's Thurston's and the City of Dreaming Spires, was that he did send his trainees every year to a particular conference in Oxford, which is called Topics in Gastroenterology. And actually this is the book they used to produce every year, which I kept, and as you can see, it's become a bit disheveled. But the gentleman who ran this course was, to my mind, one of the great figures of gastroenterology, and somebody that absolutely none of our trainees have ever heard of. It's terrible. So Sidney Truelove, and you'll be very interested in this, Sidney Truelove was probably the most accomplished, one of the most accomplished of all British gastroenterologists. He never became a professor in Oxford because he didn't do basic science. Very interesting. Anyway, so he actually did the first randomized controlled trial in all of medicine when he showed that cortisone was effective. He did seminal studies on the prognosis of ulcerative colitis, which are still used as a standard today. And he also, and this is a more technical thing, he also demonstrated in a very clever way many, many years ago how a particular drug worked that's very effective in colitis. And these are some of his seminal papers from, as you can see, they're from a long time ago. But the other thing he did was he published this paper in 1963, which would never be accepted in a medical journal today, because it was a simple descriptive case series. And he wrote this paper about the irritable colon syndrome with the man called Nazir Chowdhury, who's now a retired gastroenterologist back in Pakistan. And he, in this paper, and we have to admit this, he described virtually everything that we know about irritable bowel syndrome still today. He said it was twice as common in women, where the pain came from, the bowel habit was variable, how it was related to defecation. In fact, that's how we define the disorder nowadays. And then the other thing he mentioned right at the end, and this is where the gut-brain axis begins to come in, was that he mentioned that the majority complained of one or more symptoms: a sense of fatigue, loss of mental concentration, depression, and anxiety. So he encapsulated the essence of this disorder, namely it's a bowel disorder which is incredibly linked to the brain, along the gut-brain axis. Now, the other thing that Geoffrey did when I was every Wednesday morning, he sent me to the Southern General Hospital in Glasgow to learn endoscopy with this man, Jerry Crean, who was another Irishman, actually a Renaissance man. He founded the Scottish Fiddle Orchestra. He had a handicap of 1 in golf. He was an amazing raconteur. He was an incredible guy. And he was very interested in dyspepsia. And actually, he had the first computer system for interrogating patients. So way back then, they had set up a system for where the computer would examine the patient, and then the doctor examined the patient, and they looked at the relationship between the two. It was one of the very first adventures in what we would now call, I suppose, artificial intelligence in terms of assessing patients. But he wrote this paper about dyspepsia. It's extremely well written. And I just highlight one part here, which I think is really beautifully written, where he says, although there seems to be no generally accepted definition of dyspepsia, the term itself seems to be used as a code word or shorthand description for a variety of symptoms implicitly attributed to the upper alimentary tract that may or may not be food related. I think that's a beautiful description of these symptoms. But I used to do clinic with him, I used to do endoscopy with him, and more importantly, at the end of the day, I'd go into his office and we'd sit down and we'd have a chat, usually about Ireland. And in that same paper, he wrote this, which resonates still with me today. We think of dyspepsia as a disease space of undetermined dimensions, occupied by many conditions that share a more or less common core of symptoms, some of which may coexist, and like others, we find it difficult to define. And you could actually use this to apply to any of these gut-brain disorders that I've mentioned, because they are spaces of undetermined dimensions occupied by many conditions that share a more or less common core of symptoms. So this was actually, which I read more after I'd left than when I was there, really still resonates with me today. So at this stage, remember now, this is way back in the Stone Age, we're beginning to think about the whole issue of the interaction between the brain and the gut, particularly relates to these common symptoms. But at that time, we were much more focused on the gut than on the brain. And the prevailing doctrine was that the reason people with irritable bowel syndrome got pain, or they got diarrhea, or they got constipation, was because they had spasm in their gut. In other words, it was a motility problem. So the last thing that Geoffrey Watkinson did for me was that he arranged for me to go as a research fellow to the Mayo Clinic and work with this gentleman, Sidney Phillips, who was actually an Australian, who actually mentored me until he died a few years ago, sadly. And I learned about motility and I learned about gastrointestinal physiology with him. It was 2 wonderful years. And from that, around that time, papers were beginning to appear talking about how stress could affect motility in the gut, could affect secretion in the gut, and the whole concept of the brain-gut axis began to evolve. And this is now, of course, a central part of how we regard these conditions nowadays. And we're talking about the connections between the brain up here and the gut over here. And there are multiple ways that these can communicate. They can communicate through nerves, such as the vagus nerve. They can communicate through the circulation, of course, through hormones. And around this time, this concept of the big brain and the little brain evolved. Now, which side you're on depends on whether you're a neurologist or a gastroenterologist, which is the big brain or which is the little brain. But suffice it to say that the whole concept of the relationship between the brain and the gut, and there is a brain in the gut, as shown here, with the enteric nervous system, and the central nervous system really began to evolve and take hold. And indeed, if you study the morphology and the function of the brain and the gut, and the brain and the brain, and the big brain, you'll find incredible number of similarities. The range of neurons that you find are very similar in terms of morphology and function. And one of the things we're very proud of as gastroenterologists is that there are as many nerves in the gut as there are in the spinal cord. We can't quite get to the brain level, but we're trying. And very importantly, because this affects how we treat conditions, you find the same neurotransmitters in the brain as in the gut. And that's why people who are given drugs for the brain can get GI side effects or vice versa. You have glial cells, you've heard about the blood-brain barrier. There's actually a blood-brain barrier in the gut as well. And the other thing, which actually I did study for a while, years later, was that the nervous system in the gut can operate independently. You can completely sever all links with the central nervous system and will continue to contract and secrete, not do everything, but it can function independently. So how do they communicate? And this is still a big puzzle, particularly when I come to talk about the microbiome and how that relates to the gut-brain axis. So what is the connection? How do they connect? Unfortunately, you'll see a lot of stuff in the media about impugning the gut-brain connection as the cause of virtually everything you can think of. But in a lot of those instances, if you step back and if you ask them, how does this connection actually occur, they've not even thought about that. So one of the main ways of communication is through the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system has 2 components. It's got the parasympathetic component, which is predominantly the vagus nerve, and you've got the sympathetic system, which includes the celiac plexus and a whole other plexi, which lie along the spinal cord and communicate with the gut. So just to make it, put it simply, the parasympathetic system, and primarily the vagus, is stimulatory. It stimulates motility, stimulates peristalsis, secretion, bile release, contracts the gallbladder, constricts bronchi, slows the heartbeat, etc. So it's a stimulating nervous system. On the other hand, the sympathetic nervous system is inhibitory. And it's this balance between the two of them that maintains homeostasis in the GI tract, in fact, throughout the body. Now, the vagus nerve, vagus actually means wanderer. Latin scholars among you will know that. Because it is an incredibly extensive nerve. Like the vagus goes all the way from the brainstem all the way down to the lower colon. And it controls a whole variety of activities, including acid secretion and motility. It links many organs, which I'll show in just a second. But one of the things that people only recently realized, well, fairly recently realized, was that while a lot of people think of the vagus as stimulating this or stimulating that, most of the nerves in the vagus are actually taking messages from the gut to the brain. It's mostly a sensory nerve. And in fact, the vagus, through the sensory nerve in the vagus and the motor nerve in the vagus, it can complete these reflex arcs which control a lot of functions. And now you'll probably read about the fact that the vagus is the target for modulation. There actually are, you can even buy these yourself. You can get these techniques for stimulating the vagus nerve, which can help a variety of conditions. But I'm not going to get into that. So these are the components. There's the afferent or sensory component of the vagus nerve, which here it senses, here looking at the cross-section of the gut, it can sense tension, stretch, it acts as a chemoreceptor. So its sensory component can sense a lot of things that are going on in the GI tract. Then, of course, transmits this to the brain, as you can see here, over here, and then the motor component comes down and in that way responds to the stimulus. And this is one example. This is a very simple one, which some of you may be experiencing right now. This is, why do I go to the bathroom right after I eat? Well, the stomach says, hey there, colon, it's your pal, the stomach, how you doing? Make some room, she just ate pizza and donuts. And then that message is sent through the brain, comes all the way down to the colon, and the colon says, okay, I'm going to get moving. I'm going to help you out here. And this is shown in detail. The other way that the gut and the brain communicate is, of course, through the circulation and through hormones. And this is particularly relevant to stress, which we'll talk about in a minute. And this system here is called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which involves obviously the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, and the adrenal glands and the hormones that they secrete, one of the important ones being, of course, cortisol. So stress is one of the best known and best understood and longest understood methods whereby you can the brain interacts with the gut. And here we're seeing the brain impacting on gut function. And the stress response, which is, of course, very important for survival, flight and fright, as we refer to it, involves the secretion of from the pituitary gland of this hormone as adrenocorticotropic hormone, producing cortisol and adrenaline, which then does all these things which help us to respond to a stressful situation, no matter what it is. And of course, the other thing we have to remember is that stress is not good for you if you have a pre-existing condition. For example, if you have ulcerative colitis, we know that one of the factors that exacerbates symptoms of people with ulcerative colitis is stress, and in fact can be ameliorated by reducing stress input. Now, so my story took another turn, and after Mayo Clinic, I worked in England for 4 years, and then actually I was at the University of Nebraska for 13 years, where I continued with a lot of this work. And then in 1998, I went back to Cork. Cork people are very special, by the way, in case you didn't know it. You've probably heard of Dublin, which is somebody will refer to it as a cosmopolitan city on the outskirts of Ireland. But Cork really is the real capital of Ireland. Maybe smaller, but it's much more important. It's the largest county in Ireland. It's referred to as the Rebel County, which goes back to our history of the Irish War of Independence. And it's home to some great writers like Michael Collins, or great statesmen like Michael Collins, short story writer like Frank O'Connor, and then more recently William Trevor, who was born in North Cork, who I thought was one of the greatest short story writers in my time. Then more recently, people like Graham Norton and Cillian Murphy, who we've all heard of. This is actually not Cork City. This is Kinsale, which is where we have our home in Ireland. So I went back to Cork and I served as Dean of the medical school there for 7 years, but actually was in Barton Cork for 14 years in total. At University College Cork, which was my alma mater, and the phrase there is where Finbar taught, let Munster learn. Finbar is a saint who may or may not have existed, but he's supposed to have founded some form of institution of learning in Cork, which is where it is George Boole who invented the mathematics, which led to computers, used to teach mathematics there. Charles Donovan, who described Leishman-Donovani, also went there. And actually it was and still is the leading research university in Ireland, more so than Trinity College in Dublin, which would love to say that it was, but in fact Cork is. And this is the quadrangle in Cork. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that shortly after I arrived in Cork, a group of us got together to submit a large grant to Science Foundation Ireland for the formation of a multi-theme centre based on the microbiome. Now, I didn't know anything about the microbiome when I got there, but I was very lucky to work with a whole variety of colleagues, and in particular Fergus Shanahan, who was the chair of medicine in Cork, and we worked together, we still collaborate, and we got funded, and it was called Alimentary Pharmacotics Centre, or APC Ireland, which was really looking at the interface between food and medicine, but looking at it through the microbiome as a vehicle. This actually, I found this photograph. This was a photograph taken at the launch of APC. There's Fergus in the middle, looking about 40 years younger. And on his left is actually the person who's currently the Prime Minister of Ireland, Micheál Martin, who at that time was the Minister for Education, which was responsible for the grants. And at the back are two people from Procter & Gamble who were our original industry partners in this particular venture. This is taken in 2023 just to show that the centre had grown slightly. It's about 200 scientists now work in the centre. And one of its main goals was to mine the microbiome to identify microorganisms or their products beneficial to health. So now I am introducing another component to the gut-brain axis, namely the microbiome. And now that we refer to that as the microbiome-gut-brain axis. And this has got a lot of traction recently, sometimes gone a bit overboard, but I want to talk about that in a little bit more detail. One of the things we were doing, as I mentioned, we were mining the microbiome for organisms that were potentially beneficial. And through a series of happenstances, we stumbled, just must be on a timer. We stumbled on this organism, Bifidobacterium. It's then called Infantis 35624. It's now called Longum 35624. And we thought this organism looked interesting, and we had some other organisms which were interesting, and we did a series of randomized controlled trials in patients with irritable bowel syndrome. And I won't go through the details, but basically, much to our surprise, this organism was particularly effective, reducing all the main symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome. And then we went on later and did a much larger study actually in the United Kingdom, where and this is just a very simple way of representing the data, where you basically asked the patient at the end of their 4 weeks of treatment, do you feel better now than you did before treatment, yes or no? And with this particular treatment, over 60% felt better. The way this particular research centre was set up was kind of interesting and unique. The Irish government, when they set this project up, they wanted applications from across science, engineering, and technology for big thematic projects. But they also expected it to have an economic benefit for the country. So one of the things you had to have was you had to have an industry partner so that you could, in the future, hopefully patent new ideas and commercialize them. Now, we didn't have an industry partner, so we made one up. And what we made up was called the alimentary health, which later became precision biotics and was then subsequently sold and it continues still to exist, and I still work with them under a different guise. And this led to the collaboration with Procter & Gamble and led to the development of a line. A line is that organism I showed you earlier, Bifidobacterium infantis 35624. And if you listen to the radio in the morning, they used to have an ad saying, brought to you by gastroenterologists. And in Europe, it's actually, we had a different partner, and it's known as Alflurex. So anyway, so that's how I got involved in the microbiome and probiotics and all that area. So getting back to this whole gut-brain axis, I mentioned earlier that way back in the 1950s, Sidney Truelove recognized that people with irritable bowel syndrome and other related conditions often have psychological distress. Not everybody has. So anxiety and depression and other psychopathologies are common, but not universal in IBS. That's very important to know. Not everybody with IBS is depressed or anxious. In fact, the majority probably are not. However, this is what's important. If you have irritable bowel syndrome and you also are anxious or you are also depressed, your symptoms are worse, you go to see doctors more often, your quality of life is impaired, and you're more likely to have other comorbidities like fatigue, poor sleep, etc. And as I mentioned earlier, stress is a major exacerbator. No matter what condition you have, stress is an exacerbator of symptoms. So by now, by this stage, the whole idea of the gut-brain axis had become enshrined into our concept of how the gut and the brain interact and how they can lead to various diseases. But now we've got the microbiome joining in, and we now have the microbiome-gut-brain axis. And this has really blossomed, and Logan asked me earlier, why is all this thing blossomed? The reason this area has blossomed is a very simple technical one, and that is phenomenal advances in the way we can analyze bacteria. In the old days, you took a sample, you plated it, some of you probably did this in your labs in college, you wait to see what grew, you look at its tinctorial properties, etc., and months later you identified what was there. Now with high-throughput sequencing, with metagenomics, with metabolomics, you can identify the complete bacterial population of a sample in seconds. That's what's made the difference. So I say enter the bugs. So with the entry of bugs into the microbiome-gut-brain axis, you've had a lot of speculations, and as somebody is no more than speculation, to tell you that microbiome is involved in the cause of everything from multiple sclerosis to autism, depression, schizophrenia, etc. I will talk about a few of those briefly, but not in any great detail. And how does that happen? It's through things secreted by bugs. Bugs actually can secrete neurotransmitters, like serotonin. They can interact with the enteric nervous system, and the neuroendocrine system, and the immune system, cause inflammation, which then leads to activation of the brain. And they can also even lead to changes in neurotransmission. But one of the things that's very important, which is often forgotten, or not it's overlooked, or maybe deliberately overlooked about all of this, is that this is a bidirectional axis. It's not all going in one direction. So the brain can influence the microbiome in a whole variety of ways, which are listed here, and similarly, the microbiome can influence the brain. Now, for obvious reasons, most of the work on the influence of the microbiome in the brain comes from animal models. It's not that easy to do, brain biopsies on people walking around. So most of the work is from animal models, and I think that is a note of caution because it may not be transferable to humans. But in animal models, they've shown that the microbiome can influence the structure of the brain, the function of the brain, and the behavior of animals in quite profound ways. Now, this is a study, this is actually getting back to our work again. So I had colleagues in Cork, and they're still collaborators of mine. One was a psychiatrist and the other was a neuroscientist. And they got very interested in the possibility, based on a lot of animal work they had done, that changing the microbiome could alter behavior. And from our suite of organisms that we had looked at, we came up with this is a different This is 1714. This is a study actually which we did not do. This was a study we gave the organism to a very well-known behavioral scientist in Germany, and he did a study in volunteers looking at social stress. I don't understand his particular methodology, it's quite complicated, but basically you stress individuals and then you look at their brain imaging. And what he was able to show is that if those who were pre-treated with the 1714, you reduced the effects of stress on brain imaging. Sorry, it must be on the timer. On brain imaging. So this was fascinating because we'd also done some other experiments which showed that if you looked at the endocrine aspects of the gut-brain of the stress response, that also was reduced by pre-treatment with the probiotic. So then we asked the obvious question. We had a line which was a probiotic was seemed to benefit the gut. We now have this other one which benefited the brain. Could we put them together and could they help patients with IBS with psychological symptoms? So we put the two of them together and we did this study. This is not a controlled study. There are no controls here. But what we showed was that if you treated these individuals with this cocktail containing the two probiotics while they were treated, their symptoms decreased dramatically, even in those with very severe symptoms at baseline. And we actually looked at their quality of life, and quality of life is a hard endpoint in these studies. You show a very significant reduction in quality of life. And what you also see here is that when you stop the treatment, they go back to baseline. So they get better, stop the treatment, they get worse again. We also found that, because these patients were all selected because they had anxiety and depression as well as IBS. And what we found was, sorry, this keeps on jumping me. What we also found was that their depression got better, but it continued to be better even after they stopped treatment. And that applied to even patients with more severe symptoms. So what this showed was that by modulating the microbiome, you could affect GI symptoms, you could affect central nervous system symptoms, but they seem to be happening in a different way. And we kind of worked out what that way was, which I won't go into. So this led to the development of another product, which is actually available in the US called Zen Biome. It's an incredible name. I didn't come up with it, or ZenFlor, or Alpha-X dual action. So we continued this work. We just presented a study at a meeting in Europe looking at probiotics in irritable bowel syndrome in children. We've done work on diet and probiotics and healthy aging, which is ongoing, just not finished. And I've also been involved in other studies of probiotics and postbiotics. Postbiotics are probiotics that have been deliberately killed by heat treatment or radiation treatment and also shown to be effective. So for the last few minutes, are we okay on time? Fine, yeah. So for the last few minutes, I want to indulge myself in an area that's been of interest to me for a long time. I will not in any way say that I'm an expert in this. I was telling Logan, our son is an English professor. And when he hears of me doing this stuff, he's just aghast. I was telling him that several years ago, Fergus Shannon, who I mentioned earlier, he and I put together a meeting in Cork on the experience of illness, where we got artists, filmmakers, poets, musicians, etc., to talk about the experience of illness. And I was, with another colleague, I did the section on the experience of illness through literature. And I wrote it up, and I showed it to Killian, that's our son. And what he sent me back was not remotely like what I had written. It was 10 times better, but I'm still recovering from the shock of this. That's 10 years ago. So what I will show you just some snippets from literature and history about the microbiome gut-brain axis. Now, one of the things you discover when you start looking into this stuff, there's nothing new under the sun. So, as always, we begin with the bard. And if you'll find throughout Shakespeare, you'll find lots of references. For example, in the Comedy of Errors, he refers to unquiet meals make ill digestions. In Cymbeline, he talks about if you're sick at sea or stomach harmed on land, a dram of this will drive away distemper. And this one, which is perfect, which is really a beautiful description of heartburn and dyspepsia. No, but it is the bosom which first feels the load of repletion and indigestion. that is incredibly prescient because this idea of repletion actually became a whole area of study over the past 20 or 30 years. And the idea there is the stomach that cannot accommodate a meal. Normally when you eat, your stomach expands about 3 times its size, but some people it doesn't. So they feel very full and uncomfortable when they eat, and that is, he refers to that as repletion, which is amazing. Well, this is the most incredible one, and the reason I didn't find this, a very brilliant South African hepatologist wrote a beautiful paper on the origins of liver disease, and he came across this. Methinks sometimes I have no more wit than a Christian or an ordinary man has, but I'm a great eater of beef, and I believe that does harm to my wit. Now, why that's of interest is that he is clearly making an association between excessive intake of protein and neurological changes. And many years later, this was described in great detail by this woman who was, again, one of the great heroes of gastroenterology, Dame Sheila Sherlock, who was really is the mother of hepatology. And she described how when you have excess nitrogen in the intestine, it gets in touch with bacteria, the bacteria change it to ammonia and other substances which are absorbed through the circulation, get to the brain, and cause what's now referred to as hepatic encephalopathy, which is a state of confusion, which has got classical neurological symptoms in these patients. So this is, so from Shakespeare to Sherlock, it took, what, 600 years, whatever. But along the way, there is a cautionary tale. And this gets back to your other favorite area, the Victorians. So the Victorians were obsessed with bowel function, as you know. And one of their big obsessions was what they called auto-intoxication. So the concept here basically was that the bugs in your colon shouldn't be there, which of course we now think is completely wrong. And if they are there, they cause putrefaction of the food that you eat, and it leads to everything. So it originated probably with this guy, I think he was Swiss actually, Ludwig Rieger. Putrefaction of proteins within the human intestine produce ptomaines, which actually were subsequently shown to be total nonsense, harmful to the human body. Bouchard said, man is inhabited most considerably in his digestive tract by lower organisms. That's really condescending to the bacteria, which we now realize are so important. Man carries within himself the cause of many illnesses. And Kellogg was really to the fore in this area, whom you, of course you all know. At the present time, there are few up-to-date medical men who do not recognize the close relation between intestinal stasis and a long list of chronic disorders. And his hypothesis basically was that if the gut didn't move, things sat there, the bacteria caused putrefaction, and you got all these illnesses. And that's why he advocated cereals to improve bowel function. But this had unintended and serious consequences, and this gentleman, Arbuthnot Lane, who actually was knighted, became president of the Royal College of Physicians, advocated removing the colon to prevent this disorder called autointoxication. And I won't go through it, but his obsession was with this stasis, that people their colons weren't working, they were causing all this trouble, so let's whip them out. And he made his name on this. So he spoke about chronic intestinal stasis leading to excessive toxic material, absorption into the circulation of a greater quantity of poisonous products, and leading to degenerative changes in every tissue in the human body. Now, there's an interesting coda to his story that he went on to actually advocate a variety of products to reduce this, for which he was actually struck off the medical register and lost his license. So he had a kind of a poor end, which he deserved, I think, for this nonsense. But this was, and you know that from, this was an obsession with Victorians, this idea. And of course, we have to mention Dickens. So this is lovely from a Christmas Carol. Again, talking about, this is brain-gut connection. So this is when he sees Marley's ghost, which he doesn't want to accept. He says, you may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of underdone potato. There's more gravy than grave about you, whatever you are. Isn't that beautiful? Amazing. But of course, we have to mention the God himself, Joyce. Now, you may or may not know this, but Joyce twice tried to go to medical school. He tried once in Paris and once in Dublin. Both times he flunked the pre-med chemistry and never progressed. His father tried to do the same in Cork, my medical school, and the same thing happened to him. But Joyce remained fascinated by medicine, because even though he didn't make it through medical school in Dublin, he hung out with medical students, including Honourable St. John Gogarty and others who became famous themselves. And he had a great understanding of medicine. Well, this is beautiful. How many of you read Dubliners? The short stories, you know, arguably the greatest collection of short stories. You know, I'm not biased in any way, but isn't this beautiful? This is in Eveline. Her distress awoke a nausea in her body, and she kept moving her lips in silent, fervent prayer. Again, the brain-gut connection. Proust had a very close relationship. Proust's father was a doctor, as you probably know, and he had terrible asthma, so he actually didn't leave his room for many years because of terrible asthma. There are a lot of wonderful medical things in Proust, one of which my favorite I will not show you because it doesn't really relate to this topic. And he said, illness is the doctor to whom we pay most heed. To kindness, to knowledge we make promise only. Pain we obey. So finishing off with some of the more recent science, and this is actually a wonderful review which highlights the main pathways whereby the brain and the gut, and in particular the microbiome, communicate. So they've listed here, this is actually a whole variety of organisms, and what they show is what I mentioned earlier. Some of them operate through the vagus nerve, as you can see here. Others operate through causing impacting on neuroinflammation. Some of them operate through other mechanisms as yet to be described. But basically, microbes have a variety of mechanisms whereby they can communicate with the brain. But I don't want you to forget the auto-intoxication story, because that emanated from an idea that made sense, which was not supported by any evidence, and led to terrible outcomes for many people. And I fear we could still have this problem. Now, I'm nervous because there's a neurologist in our presence, but one of the other interests I've had over my life is I've been interested in GI function in Parkinson's disease, and I'm still actually somewhat involved in this. But there is a hypothesis out there called the BRAC hypothesis, which suggests that the gut actually is the origin of Parkinson's disease. And what the idea here is that your various stages, the first stage is these non-motor symptoms, which originate in the olfactory bulb, which is just behind the nose. And then they progress to involve the midbrain, where you see most of the pathology in Parkinson's disease, and then later on involve the cerebral cortex. But there's more than that to it. So what this particular review, and there are many reviews like this, which suggests that actually the gut, through the vagus, may have a very important role in this. So you've got an altered microbiome down here in the gut, producing various products which interact with the immune system. They interact with nerves in the enteric nervous system, which lead to the aggregation of this substance called alpha-synuclein, which is characteristic of Parkinson's disease. And this ascends through the vagus nerve to then affect the centers in the brain, which lead to Parkinson's disease. So microbial products come into contact with our olfactory or enteric neurons, which trigger the aggregation of alpha-synuclein, and this then spreads towards the central nervous system. Eventually, the aggregate alpha-synuclein arises substantia nigra. Now, I'd forgotten this actually until I just showed the slide, but a number of years ago, we collaborated with an enteric neuroscientist who was then at the University of Wisconsin, and we did actually demonstrate the changes in the enteric nervous system that you see in the brain in Parkinson's disease with the loss of dopaminergic neurons. And others have shown many of the other features as well. And this is showing more details. So here's the various products of bacteria interacting with the immune system, leading to the aggregation of these alpha-synuclein and then transmitted via the vagus nerve. I mentioned stress earlier and how stress is such an important factor. In more recent years, there have been a lot of wonderful science showing exactly how stress mediates these effects and how the microbes are involved. This is a review from my former colleague John Cryan, showing how microbial products can affect visceral sensation, how they can affect gut contractility, motility, how they can affect the gut barrier. Now, you've all probably heard of the term leaky gut. I hate that term, and we can talk about that later. But leaky gut is really saying that the gut barrier has become leaky and allows all sorts of products to traverse it. There's some science behind that, but there's a lot of nonsense as well. But this is actually the science shown here. And then, of course, immune modulation. So in great detail, people have been able to work out how the microbes, the enteric nervous system, and the brain-gut axis interact to lead to the changes we see with stress. And in chronic stress, you get even more changes occurring. And here now, you get changes related to the endocrine component of the gut-brain axis, which lead to more chronic changes in the intestinal immune system and in hormone production, and can lead ultimately to chronic changes in intestinal dysmotility and intestinal inflammation. Now, I have to mention Alzheimer's, because again, the microbiome gut-brain axis has been involved here. You've all heard of the various proposed factors in Alzheimer's disease, or some of the risk factors. And here, indeed, gut microbes have been involved as well. In a lot of these disorders, there is an inflammatory component. And certainly, changes in the microbes in the gut can lead to inflammation and increases in these pro-inflammatory cytokines, which can lead to changes in permeability and to effects on the brain. And the gut microbes influence metabolites and lead to the production of byproducts, which can also be deleterious in terms of pathology in Alzheimer's disease. Can we cure the Alzheimer's with changing microbiomes? No. This is maybe one factor of many which are involved in the pathogenesis of Alzheimer's disease. So, to summarize, the gut has its own brain, the enteric nervous system, what we refer to as the little brain, but it's becoming a little bit bigger with time. The big and the little brains communicate through the gut-brain axis, but remember, that occurs in both directions. Using nerves like the vagus, using hormones via the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and stress provides a great example of how the brain can impact on the gut function. If severe or chronic, stress can lead to inflammation, which can become chronic. And now, as I've hoped to introduce you, now a third dimension has been added, the microbiome, leading to the microbiome-gut-brain axis. Gut microbes can influence brain structure and function in animal models. There's limited evidence for that in humans, for obvious reasons. The brain can influence microbiome composition and function, so it also works both ways. So how do I answer my initial question, who's in charge? Well, the answer is, it depends. It depends on the situation. If you're talking about stress, it's probably the brain is in charge. If you're talking about a lot of people with irritable bowel syndrome, the gut may be in charge, so it depends on the situation. But don't forget, it goes in both directions, and it involves several factors which link them together. The immune system, vagus nerve, enteric nervous system, neuroendocrine system, and the circulatory system, which are all involved, and which are only beginning to really disentangle. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Quigley. An amazing talk. I know there'll be questions. I hope there'll be questions. So Aaron's going to take the back, but please, if you just raise your hand, I'll bring the microphone to you.
So with respect to the microbiome, you didn't talk a lot about food.
No.
And I'm sitting here thinking a lot about antibiotics and how they're wildly prescribed and what they must be doing to the microbiome.
Yeah, so you've actually hit two nails on the head. So first of all, diet is a very important modifier of the microbiome. Over long periods of time, your dietary pattern shapes your microbiome. If you change your diet dramatically, even in short term, it will change your microbiome. So there's no question about that. Antibiotics are a big issue for two reasons. First of all, we know that antibiotics, particularly given early in life, can disrupt the microbiome when it's being formed. The microbiome, you're born with pretty much a sterile gut, and over the first 2 or 3 years of life, your microbiome matures very rapidly. At that time, it's very vulnerable. If you're blasted with antibiotics at that time, there's no question that it can predispose you to disease later in life, like obesity, inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, etc. Of course, the other issue with antibiotics is antibiotic resistance, which is becoming a bigger and bigger problem around the world, probably more so actually in other parts of the world than here, where you can get antibiotics over the counter. The other fascinating bit, and this one last bit I mentioned, there was a beautiful experiment done a few years ago by a guy called Marty Kagnoff in New York, where he was interested in how antibiotics that we get through the food chain, in other words, as you know, antibiotics are given to cattle to make them heavier and all the rest of it. Now, some of that would come through to us. And so he mimicked this condition in animals. So he fed animals like these minute amounts of antibiotics to simulate what would occur in humans. And what he showed was it profoundly affected their microbiome, and it also affected their metabolism, such that it predisposed them to to less lean and more fat. It was fascinating. So I think the effects of antibiotics are very profound. They are important. Obviously, they're life-saving, but I think we've got to be very careful about overprescription for that reason.
Dr. Quigley, thank you for a very intriguing talk. My questions are, all of these different potential syndromes, irritable bowel, Parkinson, et cetera, is it just the luck of the draw as to what your microbiome is? Like if you eat hamburgers from Wendy's, you're going to get bad bacteria, but if you go to McDonald's, they're better?
Yeah. So
or just fate has made you have this bad microbiome?
So,
and then the idea of the probiotics, is this to introduce good bacteria that through like a mass action effect are going to get rid of the bad actors? Is that how it works?
Well, there are two very interesting questions. So the first question is about, who develops the irritable bowel syndrome, why do they develop it? So the answer to that is complicated. So obviously these symptoms are very common, but only a minority of people who have these symptoms end up being truly affected by them. So we've got to keep that in perspective. So what are the risk factors? Being female is one. Genetics is not very important. There have been some genetic risk factors identified, but the contribution is small. What happens to you in childhood is very important. So there are a whole variety of traumas that can occur in childhood that can predispose people to severe irritable bowel syndrome. And I've mentioned the antibiotic one as well. The other thing which can cause irritable bowel syndrome, literally cause it, is a very interesting one, and that's an infection. So there have been a whole lot of studies from all over the world which show that if you get food poisoning from bacteria in particular, or even from other organisms, including viruses, for most people, about 95% of people will resolve that infection, they're fine. About 5 to 10% will go on to develop irritable bowel syndrome for the first time. And this has also been seen after COVID. So for some reason or other, in some individuals who are perfectly normal, have no symptoms, they're fine, when they get a severe GI infection, the more severe it is, the more likely they are to get it. It seems to disturb their gut function and it becomes permanent. Well, it can last for many, many years. So that's an important risk factor. So for most people with irritable bowel syndrome, we don't know exactly what causes it. We've looked at diet, you mentioned diet. At the moment, we're trying to publish a study based on that international study, which shows that there are some dietary effects, but not as big as we expected. So for the most part, we don't know. What I'm most interested in are those people who got severe symptoms such that they have to come and see doctors, they have to get medication, etc. They lose time from work, etc., etc. As regards to the probiotic effect, that's a very interesting question. The original theory when we started this area was that if you gave enough good bacteria, you could outnumber the bad ones. That's probably not what's happening, because the numbers don't add up. So if you look at the number of bacteria you have in your bowel normally, like you'd be shoveling it probiotics in to try and exceed those. It's probably much more subtle. We did a lot of work looking at how what now a line works. It's an immune modulating organism. And what it does, it actually engages with the immune system and switches off inflammation. That's one mechanism. And it does other things as well. So the way they work doesn't necessitate that you actually crowd out the bad bacteria. That may be some effect. If people have been blasted with antibiotics and a very small microbiome, maybe that would be important, but for the most part, it's more subtle effects and interactions between bacteria. Yep.
My name is Peter, and I'm a lawyer. And I'm interested in the interaction of the microbiome in human behavior or free will. What is the state of the science so far in determining the reactions, the interaction of the microbiome and higher brain functions like reason,
Right.
morality, etc.?
Yeah. So the answer is for humans, it's all speculation. As I mentioned, from animal models, there is quite a lot of good science which shows that you can alter animal behavior. This is really mice. It's all mouse work. That you can alter their behavior. You can make them more active or less active. You can make them depressed. You can make them moody. You can do by manipulating their microbiome. For example, germ-free mice, which are animals that are bred so they have no microbiome whatsoever, they behave very differently to animals which have a normal microbiome. And there are a whole lot of other manipulations that have been done which show that you can alter brain function, brain structure, brain chemistry, and behavior, including the functions that you mentioned in animals. Now, of course, some of you can't, talk to mice about free will, but you can look at other behaviors and things which mimic, and you can mimic to some extent conditions like irritable bowel syndrome by manipulating the microbiome. But I think you've got to be very careful about interpreting animal models. First of all, mice are not humans. And secondly, you can give what to man would be massive doses of probiotics to animals that are not really feasible in humans. So I think you've got to be careful interpreting those studies. But certainly putting them together, they would suggest that by manipulating the microbiome, you can manipulate brain function. But of course, I did mention along the way an observation from Shakespeare, which shows you exactly how changes in the microbiome can affect brain function. And that's a condition we deal with on an everyday basis. People who've got end-stage liver disease, they no longer have blood filtered through the liver. It's actually going directly straight into circulation. If they eat too much protein, that's going to convert to ammonia, and they will become comatose. And along the way, they will develop psychiatric symptoms, and they'll develop a lot of neurological symptoms. So it certainly can happen in humans in that extreme example. But as regards to the more subtle changes that you mentioned, we don't have a lot of data. And it's very hard to get.
Did that get you to free will?
Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry, just something.
Okay, Dr. Quigley, could you,
To somebody at the back, was there a second? Sorry.
yeah, could you make a comment on the differences between the prebiotic and the probiotic? Like a little.
Yeah, absolutely. So we use a lot of terms here, which we're not deliberately trying to confuse people, but probiotics are, by definition, a probiotic contains live organisms that, when given an adequate amount, induces a health benefit. That's the strict definition of a probiotic. A prebiotic is actually not bacteria at all. A prebiotic, they're usually carbohydrates. They're substrates that, when given to an individual, will promote the growth of good bacteria, very simply. And a postbiotic that I mentioned is actually when you deliberately kill bacteria and you administer them. And dead bacteria have effects. We did a study here actually in Houston using dead bacteria and irritable bowel, which did show effects. And you can actually put a prebiotic and a probiotic together, and that's called a symbiotic. So the terminology is endless.
So how much of this, it sounds like stress is a huge factor.
Yes.
Would you say it's the #1 factor?
Well, it's hard to say that, but stress is a big factor. And one of the things, we talk a lot about resilience now, and the ability of people to, and one of the things that, getting back to the gentleman's question back there, about what maybe differentiate one individual. It may not be McDonald's or Wendy's, but it may actually be your resilience to stress. And you can see this in people. Some people can go through a lot of stress and apparently come out okay, or maybe they suppress it, but others get completely thrown off by even minor degrees of stress. So stress is an important factor, but is it the only factor? Probably not, because you see a lot of patients, and I see a lot of patients who, and this is actually one of the reasons that I think this gut-brain axis paradigm has been very important, is that before, when I started out in this area, if you told somebody they had irritable bowel syndrome, they would leave your office. Because they say, okay, doctor, you're telling me there's nothing wrong with me, it's all in my head, I'm just making it up. Now there's a much greater acceptance of this concept of the gut-brain axis and how they interact and how they lead to symptoms. And some patients will tell you, look, I'm okay unless I'm very stressed. Or I'm okay unless I eat certain foods, whatever. But there are a lot of people who have irritable bowel symptoms who not particularly exacerbated by stress. So it's all a continuum. But stress is a very important factor, there's no question. Chronic stress is a very interesting one, because it's possible, getting back to your question, that it's possible that chronic stress can lead to more chronic changes in neural function, and that might be very important.
Thanks, Dr. Quigley.
Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm a child psychiatrist.
Great. My daughter's a child psychiatrist.
Well, congratulations and condolences. And one of the common questions is, does your child have a good appetite? And I think about sugar and my appetite for it over the course of my life cycle. And it was heaven as a child, and now as an older person, not old, it's considered to be poison. Another way to say that is the ingestion of sugar over the centuries being increasingly identified with chronic diseases and that sort of thing. And also Jim Henson's Cookie Monster,
Yes.
who famously said, what words begin with C? And he said cookie, and then he asked the question, what other words begin with C? And he said, not important.
That's right. No, the diet story, as you know, the diet thing is full of faddism. But the good news is, and this relates to your question as well, there are good studies being done on diet and on how diet affects gut function, how diet affects the microbiome, and there is good data accumulating. And what you were alluding to is very important, is that diet in childhood, in early childhood, is probably very important, in the same way that it affects the microbiome.
So do you have an opinion on, getting back to probiotics, as to whether colostrum is a good thing?
Yes, it is actually.
Repeat the question.
The question was, is colostrum a good thing? So there is actually a very good friend of mine done a very nice study on looking at colostrum in various GI conditions. And there's a lot of interest in some of these other milk components and their potential benefits. So if colostrum is highly concentrated, as you know, and there is very good evidence that breastfeeding in general is very helpful in promoting the microbiome in those early days or early weeks and months of life. For adults, yes, there is evidence that colostrum is effective. Now, the problem you always get into then is, what is the product, how well is it being quality controlled, et cetera, et cetera. So that I can't tell you, but I know there is good data to suggest the colostrum is effective. Yes.
Yes, my question is about obesity. Obviously, it's a common topic today. Everybody's trying to lose weight, and with the Ozempics. So one time I'm listening to the radio, and the topic was talking to a doctor that today they have approved the stomach surgery for adolescent people, young people.
Yeah.
Correct? Because they were saying that if we don't treat young people today, they're going to become obese. They're going to have diseases. They're going to have social problems, et cetera, et cetera. And she was saying that the connection or the signal from the stomach to the brain for some people is not functioning for them to stop
Yes.
eating. Some other people say this is BS, it's all, we are bombarded by commercials and bad food and no free will to stop eating. So my question to you is, where do you stand on the divide between these two?
Well, I think, like a lot of things, there's truth on both sides. So, you know, there's been an explosion in our understanding, and I'm not an expert in this area by any means, in our understanding of how we respond to eating. There are all these signals, and of course, we have the discovery of leptin and GLP-1 and GLP-2 and all of these hormones, which are very important in mediating how we respond to meals. I just mentioned the microbiome part, of course, I would have to mention. Was a lovely study done many years ago, or not that long ago, by the group in Washington University, where there's a particular mouse called the OB mouse, which is like, it's about 10 times the size of a normal mouse. And it's a genetic defect. And this mouse obviously becomes very fat, and they studied the microbiome of this mouse and found that it was very different from lean mice. And then they went on and actually looked at more regular obesity in mice. In other words, if you induced obesity in mice by diet, and yet again, you saw there was a different microbiome in the obese versus the lean mice. And then did a very clever thing, then took stool from the obese mouse and gave it to a lean mouse, and vice versa, and they could induce obesity or a lean state in the animal, which previously was either was not obese or lean. So what they showed basically was that the microbiome could transfer properties which were related to the development of obesity, at least in animals. And what turned out to be the explanation was a very interesting one. Certain bacteria, a lot of bacteria, are actually very good at extracting calories from components of our diet that we cannot digest, like dietary fiber, for example. The reason dietary fiber works is because we can't digest it, it goes into the colon, bacteria proliferate, and then you get an effect. So the microbiome may contribute. It may be not an enormous contribution, but the biggest contributions are related to the vagus is certainly involved, and all these peptides which are now being, which have led to the discovery of the GLP-1 agonists like Ozempic, et cetera, are all involved. So it's complicated, and it's also, the other thing which is becoming clear is that there are different types of obesity. There are different phenotypes which may have different mechanisms.
When do you recommend pre, pro, postbiotics? Would you recommend it for everyone or only for very specific problems?
It's a great question. It's the one that I get all the time. So if you're eating a good balanced diet, you probably don't need any supplements of any sort, would be my first statement. Secondly, there certainly are situations, irritable bowel is one of them, there are situations where prebiotics, probiotics, postbiotics are helpful in reducing symptoms, and there it's very specific ones. And I mentioned a line, I don't want to mention this anymore. I no longer have any financial interest in that. I did have at one stage. But there are probiotics which have been tested in very specific conditions and have been shown to be effective. Most of the stuff that's out there has never been tested, has probably not been subjected to quality control. Like I've worked for many years with a nonprofit called the International Scientific Association for Prebiotics and Probiotics, which bring out evidence-based guidelines. And if you just, it's ISAP, ISAPP, if you look up their website, it'll contain all this information. And they have just developed very simple, about 5 or 6 properties that any probiotic should have. It should be alive and demonstrated to be alive for the shelf life of the product. It should be characterized at genome level, which is very easy to do nowadays. It should have a demonstrated health benefit. It should survive transit to the GI tract. What's the point in taking a probiotic that's killed in the stomach if it's supposed to act in the small intestine or the colon? So there are quite a few simple things that a good probiotic should satisfy. 95% of them do not. It's an unregulated area, which is a pity. Well, it's regulated, but under such a low bar that it's not wrong. Yes.
I note that as we get older, concerns often come around about Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, and I've never seen anything that would say that we have in mind the causes of either one of them. Now, really intrigued by your slides. They were very dense and a lot of information on each one, and you couldn't possibly get into any.
And that's the whole idea, because I was hoping nobody was spot that I didn't know them either. That's right.
But on both those questions about the
Yes.
causes of Parkinson's and the causes of Alzheimer's, there was some mention about causes, and it just caught my attention.
Sure.
But we went on. You know.
Sure. Well, so I'm not a neurologist. There is a neurologist in our presence. So what I would say is that, we've learned a lot about Parkinson's, and one of the things we have learned is there are many phenotypes. We call them phenotypes, very different characteristic types of Parkinson's. Some people have very rapidly progressive Parkinson's. Some people develop at a very young age. Some people have slowly progressive Parkinson's. So Parkinson's is a syndrome rather than a single disease entity. We know the pathology in Parkinson's. We know exactly what the pathology is, but what causes that pathology is a mixture of factors. There's certainly genetic factors, much stronger in some forms of Parkinson's than others. I think that's fair to say. Genetic factors are much stronger in some forms of Parkinson's than others. And there was a drug which was very commonly used many years ago. It was used by drug addicts, which caused Parkinson's. I don't think that's around anymore. MTPT, yeah. So there were other drugs we used to use commonly, which actually caused the Parkinsonian syndrome as well, which are not used that much anymore. So there are a lot of clues out there. Alzheimer's, again, they are defining a whole varieties of Alzheimer's, and there is really significant progress in that area. Genetics are a factor, but there are other factors. There's a lot of interest in some environmental factors being involved, particularly in Alzheimer's. So we'll see. But we're still a long way to go.
Okay, we're on time, but for 2 minutes, and I've waited a year to ask this question. I'll make it super compact and give me the non-Irish answer.
Yeah.
I go to the doctor every year to get a physical, and I get a blood test, and I'm told what my cholesterol is, and it needs to be moved up or down, and my vitamin level is up or down, and we'll take this or that. Yeah. Why don't we get a microbiome score? Why can't we get a score that says you need to add this to your microbiome or take it out?
That's a great question, and I'm delighted you asked me that. I'm delighted. And I'm glad you waited a year, because within quite recently, I can give you a lot better answer. So the answer is, some are going to hate this. These microbiome tests are a waste of time right now, and I'll tell you why. And the reason is we still do not know what is a healthy gut microbiome. We have a lot of ideas. The other factor, as we alluded to, there's so many factors that affect the microbiome. Your microbiome changes. Your diet affects it, your medications, a whole lot of factors affect it. So, and it's clear that what may be a quote-unquote unhealthy microbiome for one person may be quite healthy for another. So being able to diagnose, or more likely prognosticate for an individual based on their microbiome is not yet possible, is my answer. There are lots of people who disagree with me. The reason I said it's good for you to wait a year, so very recently there was literally 50 microbiome scientists, and I wasn't one of them, got together and produced this very dense and complex document which addressed this issue and concluded that it's not ready for prime time. There's a lot of promise. There are other issues which they go into in great detail, and that's the other issue, standardization. Microbiome tests are not all the same. It depends what primers you use and how you store the sample, et cetera, et cetera. So it's impossible to generalize just on a snapshot, just one stool sample. So,
ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Eamonn Quigley.